All right, let's begin with a prayer, shall we? Let's bow. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the beauty that surrounds us every day. We pray your blessings on our class this morning, that it will be both encouraging and maybe challenging for each of us. We pray for our lives this week, that you will help us to remember your presence with us this week. Carry it with us and live accordingly. Bless this time together now, we pray it in Christ's name. Virgil and I are about that close to getting the videos up, okay? We're still working on it. I think this week I'll be able to get them up. I finally got into my blog, and then we just have to figure out how to get me the videos, and I can post them up there. So, for those of you who have asked, who said you were going to be gone after a couple of weeks, we'll have those all up there for you. So just be patient, and do appreciate that with everybody. All right, so is change, the title of this lesson was For the Sake of Change. Is change good or bad?
It's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, now, come on, no, we're not the I know that's going to happen. I know that's going to happen. Pick a side. Pick a side. Is it good? Who says change is good?
Change of what?
Well, I'm just asking you. Who says change is bad? Some of you. Most people are okay. Are you guys really okay with change?
It depends.
Sorry? I heard a voice over here. What did you say?
Depends. You haven't changed most
It kind of depends on what it is that has to change, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some things are okay. Some things we want to change. Some things ought to change. Most of you know my wife and I just moved here, and it was an interesting change because we had to get rid of a huge amount of stuff. That wasn't always easy, but watching your stuff get taken away by the garbage men and giving it away to people, you can't sell it because nobody wants it, just throw it away. That can be, there are worse changes you have to make, but that's one of them. And it's not always easy to move to a new place. Then you have to develop a new social network. You have to get to know other people. It can be difficult. Change may or may not be easy depending on what you're asked to change. And sometimes it is good. Sometimes change is good. How about protesting?
It's better.
How many say protesting is bad? Oh, now come on, I didn't ask you that. I know that's going to happen in here. And that's really the issue, isn't it? Well, it depends on what you're protesting. All right. I'm definitely more on the negative side of that because I think there are better ways to address problems. Now, again, depending on what the problem is, I understand it. And, you look at what's going on in Hong Kong right now. They want democracy. And we would say, well, that's a good protest. All right? Most of us would anyway. I would. Fact is, protests can turn pretty violent. Is that good or bad? Well, some suggest it's the only way to make changes, but I'm not so sure. Anyway, it just kind of gets us into our discussion this morning about 1 Samuel 7 and 8, which to me is kind of is sort of the pivotal chapters here in a way, because part of what 1 Samuel is doing, part of the reason 1 Samuel is written, to help people understand and justify the monarchy, which is coming next. They haven't had that up to this point. In fact, one of the statements that was made at the end of the book of Judges was, everyone did as he saw fit. There was no king in Israel. Somehow, I don't know if that was the writer's comment to sort of justify having the monarchy, but that's a lot of what's happening in this book, is sort of justifying the monarchy and the problems with the beginning of the monarchy, as we'll see with Saul. But chapters 7 and 8 tell us how it came about, how the monarchy came about. And it was just didn't seem like it started off with a good change to me. That's what it looks like to me. Let's talk a little bit about Samuel's ministry. We haven't, the first couple of chapters, I realized as I've read through some of this again, I didn't spend much time talking about Samuel himself. And a lot of what we see here in chapter 7 of 1 Samuel is about Samuel's ministry. So what do we know about Samuel's ministry? What did he do? How did he approach it? First of all, was Samuel recognized as a prophet? Guy comes along and says, well, I'm a prophet. Listen to what I say. How do we know that?
As a boy,
Okay, as a boy, what happened, Bruce?
he heard the voice of God and kept coming to Eli and wanting to know what's going on. And
Okay.
it became clear that it was actually God speaking.
All right, can you give me a section to read, a chapter and verses? I tried. I thought he could show off for you. How about chapter 3, verses 19 through 21? Bruce, how about reading it for us? Chapter 3, 19 through 21. It becomes apparent very early on that Samuel has been visited by God himself. 1 Samuel 3, 19 through 21. I'm sorry, Bruce, I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
All right, 19 and 20.
19 through 21, please.
The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word.
Okay. Now, this is before all of what happened, what we talked about last week with the ark being captured and everything, and Samuel's ministry begins as a young boy, and I don't know how active he was during the time that the ark was captured. We're not told a whole lot of information about that. But it's very clear when you begin to read through this that God's voice is being heard, his words are being spoken through Samuel. And everybody recognizes it. Everybody looks and they see what's happening with Samuel's life. They know about, I'm sure at some point, they've learned about Hannah and how he was born. I'm quite sure those stories circulated, along with the fact that now God is revealing himself to Samuel. Okay? And so we come up later on in this chapter, when we get into chapter 7, then we actually see Samuel at work. Okay, up to this point, it's been telling us about a number of other things. Here we see Samuel at work. So what happens? What does he do? How does he go about his ministry? What was his message and the focus of his work?
Get rid of the idols.
Get rid of the idols. What else? Anything else?
Kind of a circuit rider judge.
Yeah, it was kind of a circuit rider, wasn't he? Yeah, he went around chapter 7. My book is around here somewhere. I was late this morning, so I'm really confused here. I don't even know where I put it. I knew I had a Bible here somewhere. 1 Samuel chapter 7. Most of chapter 7 is basically taken up with what he does. Now, I don't know about you, but I look at some of this. That's maybe a little... Chapter 7. Time went by until 20 years had passed since the ark had been taken to Kiriath Jearim. Then the whole house of Israel longed for the Lord. Samuel told them, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, get rid of the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths that are among you. Dedicate yourselves to the Lord and worship him only. Then he will rescue you from the Philistines. Actually, I've got these things switched here, so I'm going to do this. Let's go through here. And I'll come back to that. All right. Does 20 years seem like a long time for them to seek the Lord?
Yes.
It does seem like a long time, doesn't it? I kind of wonder how they sustained that intensity, if it was an intense searching for God. 20 years is a long time. But as Larry said, we've got people now. Does it surprise you that Israel is still kind of in the grip of idolatry? I see a couple heads going no. This means yes. This means no. How many think it's surprising that they're still being tempted by these idols? How many are surprised by that?
Well,
Go ahead.
as you pointed out in your book, their ears were ringing. They had a bad case of tinnitus, I think.
Yeah.
They just couldn't let go with what they were seeing in the other countries around them.
Right, right. I don't know if I want to say surprised at this, but we look at it and go, well, it shouldn't be that way, should it? They should have learned their lesson by this time after all they've gone through in the desert. How many hundreds of years or decades it was between then and now. They should have been learning their lesson, and they just don't seem to get it. And it's really not even until the Babylonian captivity in 586, that's when they finally get it. After that, they at least realize we've been doing this all wrong. And then a few people come back to Jerusalem, they rebuild, and you really don't have too much information about what's going on between then and the time of Christ, but you begin to realize they at least got this one part of it right. They're only going to worship one God. Up to this point, they are constantly being tempted by all these other idols. That just, I don't know. Is it just human nature? Yeah, Ron?
Well, I was thinking about that as we finished up our study of Genesis on Wednesday night. Because here you have Joseph, who married the Egyptian princess, okay? And Joseph, his part of the kingdom was that Ephraim part. And they were the ones that really went bad. And mothers have a huge influence on their children, and I guess I wondered if marrying that Egyptian princess might have set Ephraim and Manasseh at least on the wrong track in regard to idols.
That's an interesting historical theory. It's possible.
Yeah.
It's possible. One of the things we definitely see in the Old Testament is sometimes these prejudices and tendencies do get passed on from generation to generation, don't they?
In a very short period of time, David and Saul, or David and Solomon rather, with 10 of the 12 tribes were going right back to idolatry.
Yeah.
And then they get punished severely by the Assyrians, and the other 2 tribes still don't learn anything.
I know.
But hindsight's a beautiful thing.
It is. At least we have it.
Yes.
And we have these examples of what happens when people keep rejecting. You remember one of the things I said in the very beginning of the first class was Romans chapter 14 or 15. These things are written as examples for us, so we learn from one. There is an irony, is there not? I mentioned this on page. What's the whole irony here when Israel starts asking for a king? What's ironic about it?
Already got
Well, they already had a king. So they spent 20 years searching for God, looking for God, repenting, etc., etc. And what happens after 20 years? They reject him. To me, that's, and I'm sure I'm guessing he's thinking the same thing. Guys, what's going on here? You just spent 20 years repenting, putting away the foreign idols, and then you come along and you reject them. Yes?
We can think of someone who is age 10 and someone who is age 30 could be involved in this.
Can you explain?
It's 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So a 10-year-old has 20 years 50.
Okay?
So, when this was happening, it could be a child before they got older.
So you think maybe do you think the protests are being fueled by the younger generation? Is that what you're suggesting?
No.
Okay. I'm
I'm
missing.
just suggesting that people are at a different age
Okay.
when it started.
Okay.
So when you say as far as 20 years, that doesn't surprise me. Because a 10-year-old isn't gonna have the maturity.
No. And we really don't know specifically who is fueling all of this protest, do we? I'm gonna go back. I can't go back. Let's see.
Let's mention the elders of Israel, so you have to wonder. They're the ones who went to Samuel in the beginning.
Say that again, Mike, I'm sorry.
Well, it mentioned chapter 8 that the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel. They're the first ones who seemed to bring this up. We want a king. So
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily suggest that it might have been a younger generation. The leaders are the ones who went to Samuel and
Yeah.
first asked for a king.
Yeah.
But there's a disconnect that maybe, for me anyway, I get the sense that his sons, who were horrible judges, brought on a lot of people's discontent. And then yet in Eli, him and his sons end up perishing. In this case, at least scriptures are silent to Samuel's reaction to his son's evil.
Right.
And so there's a little bit of, when I use my human logic, you go, well, I wonder what the deal was, or the scriptures are just silent about it. But I get the sense that people were discontent because they was being abused by his sons.
You just sort of given me a nice segue to question one. Let's go back and let's talk about the protests themselves a little bit. Who said that they thought protests were good or bad, right? They can be, depending on what it is we're protesting. I think that was what some of us were suggesting when I asked the question. Look at question one. What was Israel's motivation in this protest? John mentioned one of them. What was one? One of them was Samuel's sons. They weren't following in their father's footsteps. And people could see that they were corrupting what Samuel had established as the judgeship. What else was the motivation for this protest?
We want to be like everyone else.
What's that?
Be like all the other.
They want to be like all the other nations. What do you think? Just think about protests. How much emotion do you think was invested in these protests? What kind of emotions do you think were driving them?
Discontent.
Discontent? What fuels discontent?
Desperation.
Desperation?
Maybe a little bit of fear.
Fear? I hadn't thought of that one. That's probably true. We don't want this to continue on the way it is. Yeah.
I guess when you see the other guys, right, the other nations, sort of like prospering or taking it easy or having a good time. I mean, the Psalms are all over the place saying that about how, the evil man flourishes and all sorts of stuff. You see that now, I'm like, you know what? Can I have some of that? Can I please have some of that?
What emotion are we talking about there? Jim? Jealousy. Yeah, they're a little jealous.
Envy.
Envy? Yeah. They see everybody. They see the other nations, and at least whether they're viewing it accurately or not, they see they got something we don't. How accurate that is, maybe part of the question here. But whatever it is they're seeing they got what we want. Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, and with the king, we can send them out and they'll fight our battles for us. We'll
Yeah.
win.
Yeah.
They don't realize that God
Well, there's something kind of interesting about that. What happens in chapter 7? What's going on there in chapter 7? It's kind of an interesting point to me.
God relieves them of the Philistine.
Yeah, God fights for them even before they have a king, doesn't he?
Yeah.
How much of that are they really thinking about? Hey guys, I'm guessing Samuel probably said at some point, don't you remember what happened just recently with the Philistines? You want a king to go out and fight your battles? God just destroyed them for you. And now you want a king to do what God already did. Again, there's a certain irony about all this, that they keep rejecting God and God keeps doing things for them and they just keep rejecting him. Yeah.
It's like us today, it's not, they couldn't see him physically.
No, of course not. Yeah.
He wasn't at the head of the line leading the soldiers like a king would, like an earthly king would be. I mean, I was talking about this yesterday, with some, at the teenagers. We always want to do it our way first, even though God is there to take care of us. Because we can't see it. I mean, we don't wait.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can see a king.
Yeah.
He's visible and he can do things. All right. That we can't see God. We don't know if God's going to act. A king is supposed to act. We can
push a king.
We can do whatever it needs to do to get the king to do our bidding for us. Yeah, exactly. I think. Hang on a second. I have a hand over here. I'm going to go in order as best as I can. Okay, Jim.
Age before beauty.
Yo. Hear
that, beauty?
I'd take that one. I would take it. Go ahead.
We were all thinking.
I was wanting to link that irony that you're talking about that something happened way back in Genesis 31. And then also segue because of not being able to see an invisible God. But remember Rachel, when she was coming back from her father Laban escaping, she hid his household gods in her saddlebag under the camel, on the camel there. And makes you wonder how that permeated the whole family there, all those children, and she still clinging to those, and we don't know if they were Ashtaroth or Baal, whatever they were, but they're household gods.
Yeah, that's there's a whole family dynamic that we could get into at some point. But right. By the way, the household gods back in the ancient Near East kind of represent. It was sort of the. I think this is what I read, that they were like the documents of ownership. I think that's how they saw them, partly. So when she took his God, she took all of his stuff. I think that's kind of what they represented, but that's another whole issue. But yeah, I mean, idol worship was just so permeated that culture that they just carried it on. Yeah, right here.
Well, you kind of scratch your head. You're asking the question, gee whiz, God's done all this, and then quickly they dump him. They just spent 20 years repenting, refocusing, and then immediately turn on a dime. And I think that's why, I defend the Jewish nation a lot of times because we're just as fickle. But I think the thing that we get frustrated with is that we see, God, Samuel tells us that God thundered and had the Philistines so confused and scared that they just, it was an easy victory, and he split the Red Sea, and there are all these visible, tangible miracles, and and God had more direct interaction with the Israelites, and I think that's what frustrates us as we look back at these stories today, is that, and how many times have we been in a situation of need and we say, God, just show me a sign. You kind of have that thing like, give me something tangible.
Right,
and,
right.
I think that's why we get frustrated when we look back at these stories and say, how how could you miss?
How could you possibly miss? But we still do. John?
I think it's interesting in this 20 years that you refer to, they weren't being molested by the Philistines. Things were actually going pretty well. And there is that strong human nature that permeates generations of when things are going pretty well, I look around me and you know what, everybody else has got better than me. And if I only had, fill in the blank, like so-and-so, things would even go better for me because surely their life's better than mine, right?
Yeah.
You know, surely they're getting along better than me. And so maybe some of that is just human nature of looking around them. Yes, it was ubiquitous, the idolatry and stuff, but part of that is, well, they have X and surely they have more than me. And I want what they have.
Mike?
I kind of overlap with what he just said.
You
I
speak
think
up
they
so-
have,
yeah,
they,
speak up so Rick.
I think they haven't forgotten the 20 years they waited. Repenting for 20 years. They probably saw, hey, we turned to God and repented in year 1. God didn't see true repentance until maybe year 20.
Yeah, yeah.
But that was a long time to
That's
them.
true. Yeah, I hadn't
You know,
thought
like,
about that.
Where's he been the last 19
Exactly.
years?
Yeah, okay.
We don't want to go through this
I
again.
hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. Yeah. Keep praying and praying and praying. You don't get an answer to your prayer. What do you feel like?
Nobody's listening.
Where is he? Yeah, where's he been? And again, I know I mentioned this last week. We're going to get into some of the Psalms of David when we get to a few later lessons. David goes through some of that. You read the Psalms and you have this strong element of David saying, oh, what's going on here? You haven't been listening. You haven't been hearing my prayer. Not all the time, but occasionally he will go through that. But he keeps coming back to God. That's a good point. Yeah,
Well,
Mike.
it occurs to me that I guess we shouldn't be too surprised at their desire for a king because, in a sense, their struggle is with idolatry, and isn't the desire for a king in some ways simply another manifestation of idolatry? I mean, how many nations have we seen end up worshiping their kings as if they were gods?
Yeah.
And how many kings seize upon that and, in fact, declare themselves to be deity?
Yeah. It's good to be the king.
So, in a way, it is simply another manifestation of the idolatry that they struggle with. This is their new idol.
Yeah.
The king.
Yeah. Yeah. What was, maybe the obvious question, what was Samuel's interpretation of the protests? How did he see them?
Rebellion against God.
Yeah, faithlessness. Guys, you're being faithless here. Okay.
Well, his first reaction is they don't like me.
Huh. Yeah, God tells him, don't worry, it's not you, Samuel, it's me. He does. Larry?
I was just wondering the expression on Samuel's face whenever he tells God all these things that the people are saying, and God says, okay, listen to him, give him a king. I mean, I think that Samuel may have wanted some direction here. What else can we do?
Yeah, maybe so. It is kind of fascinating, isn't it, that God gives in to this,
Yeah.
despite the fact it wasn't the best course of action. God lets him. God's still going to use them. He's still going to use the whole situation. And of course, later on, he's going to use David in the most profound way of all of the kings. So, let's talk about this one. Becoming like the nations. Is that good or bad? Go with my questions. Are there advantages or disadvantages in appealing to our neighbors by being like them? I see this in a number of churches, all kinds of churches. They try to do things, and preachers do this all the time. We use phrases and allusions to things that are common in our culture to try to appeal to people. Okay, you might give a sports analogy or something, because we all, some of us like sports. So, we use those things from our culture to help explain the gospel. How is that? how I'm going to ask this, except to say, are there advantages or disadvantages in appealing to our neighbors by trying to show them, well, you know, we're just like you guys?
Yes.
Yes. I set myself up for that all the time. You want to explain that a little bit?
Well, certainly we want to be approachable. We don't want to be the kind of people that everyone thinks we think we're holy in a way that lords it over other people.
Okay.
We are holy people, but we want to share that in a way that is approachable. So we can say, look, we can all approach God. You just need to look into His Word and find out what He wants you to do.
Yeah, in one sense, we're not all that different. We're sinners like you. And we know it. Some people seem to assume Christians don't get it, don't know that they're sinners. We do. That's why we're here. We don't come here because we're not sinners. We come here because we are. So yeah, in one sense, we're like everybody else, but there's still some.
We are worshiping a God who is holy and set apart.
Yeah.
And we need to treat Him that way.
Yeah. Okay. Did you hand up?
Yeah, Jesus taught parables, so people can understand what he's talking about.
Okay. We use a common way of getting information out. Sure. So we can say sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. What did you think about my discussion in there about, well, let me just remind you, I had a friend quite a few years ago who was working in a ministry in Connecticut, actually, and they did some things that they were sort of following a school of thought which had suggested, and this was quite a ways back, 60s and 70s. People were talking about communication and how important it was to communicate your ideas clearly. And so their theory was, we're not communicating the gospel very well, so we got to start using different terms. We can't talk about you can't use words like redemption. Most people would go, well, that doesn't mean anything to me. Okay. So you might try to change the word to something else that people do know. This particular group, they weren't calling themselves a church, they were calling themselves, I can't remember what I said. Family Life Center, thank you. Just catching up with me. They were a family life center, and they kept calling God an entity. And I talked to my friend, I said, you know, you're not really communicating what you want to communicate. You're telling people something they already know. They already know about an entity. And this, you know, the force, may the force be with you. If God is a force, which there's a certain part of that that's true, but you're communicating something from Star Wars that they already know. That doesn't teach them anything different. Is God the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or isn't He? And I don't remember whether or not my discussion with my friend made a difference or not, but the fact is, I felt like it was not a very good way to communicate because you weren't really telling them anything new. You were trying to be like everybody else. I saw that as a problem. And it just seems to me that we have to think about, are we going to be the church or are we going to be something else? In our attempts to influence our neighbors, do we seek to be like them or do we seek to provide them with a better alternative? That's question 5. How we go about doing that? Maybe that's for our discussion. Is that worth a few words? Yeah, Jen?
I remember during that time that, even subsequently, there's the New Age kind of thinking where people say, you know, the universe is telling you. You know, really? What's the universe saying? You know? I don't even know what that means when people start talking about the universe telling you.
Yeah.
And then watering down the concept of God. They're watering it down. That's what that, I think those people were good-hearted, and I think they were trying to get another method that would break through. But you can water down the essence of God. And God is God. He's not the universe. He created the universe.
Yeah.
And so when I say, or someone says, the universe told me, they're saying, I've got a little set of rules that I'm following my way.
you move from calling God a being with a will, with thoughts, who can speak to us, to a God who is just sort of some inanimate thing, that's quite a bit different, isn't it? This one over here, this is what we believe. And how do we communicate that? How do we get through to a people who say, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, which is one of the things I know we've experienced a lot of. How do you get through to that? How do we make sure we know that they know there's a distinction here? I don't know, just food for thought perhaps. Yeah, right here.
I was just thinking about Paul when he was talking to the people about the unknown God. He started where they're at and then he moved it to the truth.
Yeah, and we're still in an environment like that, aren't we? We're still in an environment like that very same thing. So I think it's a good question for us to keep in mind. How are we going to demonstrate that distinctiveness to them? How can we communicate that to them without watering it down to something that they already know? Anyway, to me, that's some good food for thought in terms of how we go about influencing our neighbors, how we go about at work. How do we find opportunities to do that? Do we get opportunities to do that, and so forth? Let's get real quickly. I want to get to. Let's just go right to questions. Question 6. Change. That was kind of the issue of this chapter, wasn't it? Change. Right? What change is good? What change is not so good? Give me some New Testament passages which tell us the kinds of things we're supposed to change. Specific things we're supposed to change. And why is that different from just protesting the government?
Ephesians 4:28 through 5:20 tells us to change from the ways of the world to love and peace and all of the other things that Christ, that would be representation of Christ.
If I remember correctly, part of that passage is, let's not continue to live the way the Gentiles do, in darkness. Okay. So there are some very specific changes that have to be made. Israel was trying to change an institution, weren't they? Or they were at least trying to establish a different kind of institution. When I think what Samuel had been trying to do for all those 20 years was to change their thinking as well as their affections. And when I say affections, I don't mean just our emotions, the things we care about. As Christians, we're not only called to change the way we think, we're called to change the things we really care about. What things do we really care about? That's more of an internal change, isn't it? It's not just changing an institution, it's not just changing where you live, it's not just, changing any number of other things. It's really about changing ourselves. It's about changing the things that we think about and care about. Israel had not done that, it seems to me. And that was part of the problem that we're dealing with here. Yeah.
Have to change their heart.
Exactly. Exactly. The heart being the seat of not only your thought, but also your emotions. Yeah, and your actions, which hopefully would follow from the thoughts and the things you care about. Sure.
But it also goes back to your last question of how do we be effective doing that?
Yeah.
And part of it starts with our heart and our motivation, or the words and the message that we're going to use and why.
Yeah. Samuel seemed to me to be spending a lot of time trying to get them back to that. Still gave them the monarchy, and the rest of it, sort of just plays out the way it does. The next chapter sort of gets us into some of what I heard some discussion about, and that is the future. Okay. Is having a king going to make our future better? Well, that's what they thought it would. Okay. They thought that was the key to giving them a really good future. And so that's sort of what we want to think about next. comments or questions? I apologize for being late. It kind of got me a little bit, just disconnected in my thoughts, but I hope we had some good discussions. Any final thoughts? All right, that's good. Thank you. Final day.